وعلى آل سيدنا مولانا محمد وبارك وسلم وصلي عليه الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا حبيبي يا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا رحمة للعالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh to Sheikh and to all the participants. Welcome to tonight's session, and without any further ado, I hand over to Sheikh, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. قالوا سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا وارزقنا عملا صالحا ورزقا واسعا وشفاء من كل داء. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. أما بعد. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the finest of salutations upon his beloved messenger, Sayyiduna Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for having granted us the opportunity to present ourselves in the presence of ilm and to have allowed us to contemplate, to read, and to engage in meaningful contemplation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. And in the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the night and day changing or rotating are signs for those that have intellect. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from amongst those who perceive the message for what it is and understand it and put it into practice. I think it would be good if we went back a little bit, just to be able to recap. It's been about 2 months since we've met or spoken and had class. We were discussing a couple of categories of stuff, and I think it's best we discussed one or two of them, and it will be best to be able to understand it in context again. Imam al-Ghazali continues, and we continue reciting, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us benefit from Imam al-Ghazali's knowledge and from his works, both in this world and in the year after. And he says, أيها الولد إذا علمت هذا الحديث لا حاجة إلى العلم الكثير. وتأمل في حكاية أخرى، وهي أن حاتم الأصم كان من أصحاب شقيق البلخي رحمة الله تعالى عليهما، فسأله يوما قال صاحبتني منذ 30 سنة ما حصلت فيها. He says, if you understand the hadith that was just mentioned, which was to do for your dunya in extent to your existence, or to your in extent to the duration of your stay in the dunya, and do for your akhirah in extent to you remaining in the akhirah, and do for Allah in extent to your need for Him, and do for the fire in extent to your patience over it. And so is the Imam al-Ghazali says, if you understood this hadith, then there's not a lot left to seek knowledge about. It says, and then think about and contemplate the story and that is the following story, and that is that Hatim al-Asam, who was one of the companions of Shaqiq al-Balkhi, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhima, and both of them were from the great ulama. And he says, and he asked him one day, he says, you stayed with me and you took my company for 30 years, or since 30 years you've been keeping my company. What have you achieved in it? So he says, I achieved 8 benefits from knowledge. وهي تكفيني منه لأني أرجو خلاصي ونجاتي فيها. And he says that I found 8 benefits in knowledge, and they're sufficient for me because I see my salvation and my and me being saved from everything in these 8. فقال شقيق ما هي? And then Shaqiq al-Balkhi asked him, he said, what are they? And Hatim said, الفائدة الأولى. He says, إني نظرت إلى الخلق فرأيت لكل منهم محجوبا ومعشوقا يحبه ويعشقه محبوبا. He says, I looked at the creation and I seen that for each of them, they have a beloved from hub, mahbub, and ma'ashuq. It's a higher degree of love. It's someone they love and they cherish. وبعض ذلك المحبوب يصاحبه إلى مرض الموت وبعضه يصاحبه إلى شفير القبر. He says some of these beloveds, they accompany him to the deathbed, to the sick bed, to the deathbed, and others accompany him right to the grave. ثم يرجع كله ويتركه فريدا وحيدا. And then they all come back and they leave him all alone. ولا يدخل معه في قبره منهم أحد. And no one goes into the grave with him. فتفكرت وقلت أفضل محبوب المرء ما يدخل معه في قبره ويؤنسه فيه. And then he said, and I thought about this, and I realized that the only beloved that should accompany me is the beloved that will keep me company in my grave. فما وجدته غير الأعمال الصالحة. And I didn't find it except in good actions. فأخذتها محبوبة لي. And I took it as my beloved. لتكون لي سراجا في قبري وتؤنسني فيه ولا تتركني فريدا. So that it can be a light for me or a lamp for me in my grave and can keep me company and won't leave me alone. The second benefit, he says, I seen the creation following their desires and rushing to the objectives of themselves. And I contemplated that. I contemplated the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a verse of the Quran. It says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. It says, whoever fears the station of his Lord, in other words, or the standing in the presence of his Lord, and stops the nafs from following its desires, and nothing but Jannah will be his abode. وتيقنت أن القرآن حق صادق فبادرت إلى خلاف نفسي وتشمرت بمجاهدتها. He says, I was sure that the Quran is haqq and it's truthful, and I rushed to contravening my nafs, and I worked hard at persevering against my nafs. وَمَا مَتَّعْتُهَا بِهَوَاهَا. And I did not let it enjoy its desires. I did not give the nafs pleasure by following its hawa or its desires. حَتَّى ارْتَاضَتْ. He says, until it This was sort of an exercise, and until it became tame. بِطَاعَةِ اللَّهِ وَانْقَادَتْ. He says, until it was tame and followed the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and stayed on that. The third benefit, he says, I seen each one of the people following or running behind, collecting the burnt wood of this world, or the destruction of this world, or the destroyed property of this world. Hutam is when there's a wreck, whatever's left. So if there's a storm, what's left after the storm? If there's a fire, what's left after the fire? Anything that's a result or that's left after destruction. And he says, I seen each one of the people following these destructed items, or this devastation of the dunya. So whatever you follow in this dunya, no matter how much it glitters and no matter how expensive it is, it's nothing but hutam, it's nothing but the leftovers after a storm. ثم يمسكه قابضا يده عليه فتأملت في قوله تعالى. So it says people gather this hutam of the dunya and then they hold it firm in their hands. And then he says, فَتَأَمَّلْتُ فِي قَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى. And then I thought of the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. مَا عِنْدَكُمْ يَنْفَدُ وَمَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ بَاقٍ. Whatever is with you people will deplete, and whatever is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remain. فَبَذَلْتُ مَحْصُولِي مِنَ الدُّنْيَا لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى فَفَرَّقْتُهُ بَيْنَ الْمَسَاكِينَ لِيَكُونَ لِي ذُخْرًا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. So he says, and then I spent whatever I have attained and obtained from this dunya for the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I distributed it between the poor so that it can be a savings for me with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here we see complete trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. First, the first step to walking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making your beloved in this world good actions. The second is contravening the nafs. And the third is sending forth or spending from your wealth so that you can send forth that spending of yours as a precursor to you passing away and meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the fourth benefit, he says, I seen some of the creation thinking that honor and izzah is in having a big tribe or a big family, فَاعْتَزَّ بِهِمْ, and then he can boast about them. And others, they seen it in great wealth and in great children, and they boasted about it. And others, they thought that this glory, this izzah, this glory, and this honor is in forcefully taking other people's wealth from them and oppressing them and killing them. Very much like what we see the Jews do today in the world. This is very applicable to them. And then he says, I contemplated the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The most virtuous amongst, or in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the most pious of you all. فَاخْتَرْتُ التَّقْوَى. I chose taqwa. وَاعْتَقَدْتُ أَنَّ الْقُرْآنَ حَقٌّ صَادِقٌ. And I believed that the Quran was haqq, truthful haqq. وَظَنَّهُمْ وَحُسْبَانُهُمْ كُلُّهَا بَاطِلٌ زَائِلٌ. And then I was sure that these people's opinions, those that looked at honor and glory in being in wealth and in big families and in children and in bullying people, he says, I realized that these are all batil, this falsehood, and it's za'il, it will deplete and it will come to an end. الفائدة الخامسة إني رأيت الناس يضم بعضهم بعضا ويغتاب بعضهم بعضا. He says, I seen people speaking ill or condemning one another and speaking behind their backs, making riba. فوجدت ذلك من الحسد في المال والجاه والعلم. He says, and I found it that it was jealousy in others' wealth or in their status or in their knowledge. فَتَأَمَّلْتُ فِي قَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى. And then he says, I contemplated the verse or the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, نَحْنُ قَسَمْنَا بَيْنَهُمْ مَعِيشَتَهُمْ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. That we have divided and we have distributed between them their livelihoods in this dunya. And then I was sure that this division is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ever since. So since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala existed, فَمَا حَسَدْتُ أَحَدًا. And I didn't become jealous of anyone. وَرَضِيتُ بِقِسْمَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. And I found pleasure in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sorry, I found pleasure in the division of that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had destined for me. الفائدة السادسة إني رأيت الناس يعادي بعضهم بعضا لغرض وسبب. He says, I found people becoming enemies to one another for purposes and reasons. So whatever reasons they are. فتأملت في قوله تعالى. And I contemplated the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, إن الشيطان لكم عدوا فاتخذوه عدوا. إن الشيطان لكم عدو فاتخذوه عدوا. That shaitan is to you an enemy, so take him as an enemy. Don't become comfortable with shaitan. Don't take him as your ally. Shaitan is your enemy and deal with him as your enemy. فعلمت أنه لا يجوز عداوة أحد غير الشيطان. And then he says, and then I understood that it was not permissible to take anyone as an enemy except shaitan. الفائدة السابعة, the seventh benefit. إني رأيت كل أحد يسعى بجد يجتهد بمبالغة لطلب القوت والمعاش. He says, I seen people striving with seriousness, and they persevere exaggeratively to seek their livelihood to an extent that they are willing to go into that which is doubtful, and even worse, that which is haram. And he belittles himself and decreases from his worth by engaging in haram and engaging in even that which is doubtful. A person does or decreases from his stature. فتأملت في قوله تعالى وما من دابة في الأرض إلا على الله رزقها. That there is no person or no dabba is any beast. In other words, there's no life on this earth except that upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is its rizq. فعلمت أن رزقي على الله تعالى وقد ضمنه. And I became sure that my rizq is on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and He has guaranteed it. فاشتغلت بعبادته. And so I occupied myself with His worship. وقطعت طمعي عمن سواه. And I cut my greed. In other words, I cut hope. I lost hope, and I stopped looking at others or anyone besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with this greed. In other words, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I cut my greed for the dunya in everything besides worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The eighth benefit, he says, إِنِّي رَأَيْتُ كُلَّ وَاحِدٍ مُعْتَمِدًا عَلَى شَيْءٍ مَخْلُوقٍ. I seen everyone depending on something created. وَبَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى الدِّينَارِ وَالدِّرْهَمِ. And others depend on the dinar and the dirham, the gold and silver. وَبَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى الْمَالِ وَالْمُلْكِ. And others on wealth and mulk is possession or kingship. وَبَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى الْحِرْفَةِ وَالسَّنَاعَةِ. And others on their trades and on their occupations. وَبَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى مَخْلُوقٍ مِثْلَهِ. And others depending on creation like him. فَتَأَمَّلْتُ فِي قَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى. وَمَنْ يَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ فَهُوَ حَسْبُهُ. And whoever depends on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is sufficient for him. إِنَّ اللَّهَ بَالِغُ أَمْرِهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's amr, his instruction or his decree will be reached. قَدْ جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدْرًا. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made for each thing its qadra, its extent. فَتَوَكَّلْتُ عَلَى اللَّهِ ta'ala فَهُوَ حَسْبِي وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلِ. And I dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He is sufficient for me and the best of agents. فَقَالَ الشَّقِيقُ وَفَّقَكَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى. And Shaqiq said, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant you tawfiq, in other words, the ability to continue on this path. إِنِّي قَدْ نَظَرْتُ التَّوْرَاةَ وَالْإِنْجِيلَ وَالزَّبُورَ وَالْفُرْقَانَ فَوَجَدْتُ الْكُتُبَ الْأَرْبَعَةَ تَدُورُ عَلَى هذه الفوائد الثمانية. And so he said, I looked at the Torah and the Injil and the Zabur and the Furqan, which is the Quran, and I found these 4 books rotating around these 8 benefits. فَمَنْ عَمِلَ بِهَا كَانَ عَامِلًا بِهَذِهِ الْكُتُبِ الْأَرْبَعَةِ. And whoever practices and does and lives in accordance with these 8 benefits, he is practicing on all of these 4 books that have been revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to His prophets. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue blessing us. I wanted to get through these 8, all of them in one session, and hence there wasn't a lot of explanations, but I think reading it and shedding some light, the little light that has been shed on it as an interpretation, is sufficient for having had or in getting the meaning to be conveyed to the audience. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the ability to put into practice these 8 benefits. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from amongst those who receive salvation from the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and are capable of living a life that is pleasing to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, especially in these difficult times where haqq has become or is looked at as batil, and anyone who lives on this haqq and practices this haqq is regarded as a fool or an idiot or someone who should be ridiculed. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from amongst those who are steady on His path and who follow the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because it's only by following the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that we will raise in the ranks of spirituality and attain the purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us for. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Ameen, Ya Rabbal Alameen, to all the du'as. And Jazakallah to Sheikh for your valuable time. And Jazakallah to all the participants. And inshallah we'll meet again next week. Shukran jazeelan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.